Hi everyone, welcome back to the Global Kitchen by Chef Hari. Today's lesson is about making a very simple pizza dough, and this recipe and this concept can be used for a number of things like simple quick breads, like flatbreads, like stuffed breads, calzones, etc., etc., right? So as with any baking recipe, you have a distinction between dry ingredients and wet ingredients. So the dry ingredients for a basic pizza dough would consist of a high gluten flour, like a bread flour, a little bit of semolina. Now, people get very passionate about their proportions of flours when it comes to dough. I've chosen mostly high gluten flour or bread flour that you might get in the grocery store, and just a tiny bit of semolina flour. Now I'm going to post the recipe for this dough, so don't worry. And as I mix the ingredients, I'll talk about essentially how much I'm using of each thing. Salt, naturally, and then some kind of a leavening agent. So I have dry active yeast here. This is baker's yeast. In the grocery store you might see it as active dry yeast. Do not buy the bread machine yeast. That's a different thing altogether. So either an active dry yeast or dry yeast. And then the wet ingredients. Essentially there are two. There's some warm water and there's some extra virgin olive oil. Now, depending on the temperature in your part of the world, yeast needs basically food and temperature and moisture to grow and blossom and bloom, if you will. It's fairly warm right now in Central Florida. It's actually beautiful. It's in the 80 degrees range, if you will. But if where you are is a little bit cooler, you may need to give the yeast a little bit of help, a little bit of a head start to kind of get going. So you need some sort of a sugar product. I have here local artisanal honey. You could use naturally sugar itself. You can use some sort of a corn syrup, some sort of a molasses, anything that's somewhat sweet. Now, if you are in a warm climate and the yeast is of good quality, certainly you can leave that out. All right, so the process is very simple. Okay, 8 ounces of warm water, warm under 100 degrees, between 90 and 100 degrees. 3/4 of a teaspoon of active dry yeast or instant yeast. I'm just going to illustrate how much sugar you would add if you wanted to add it at all. Just a tiny bit. That's literally a drop of honey. And that's it. That's all you need. And then let's bloom the yeast a little bit. And you know that the yeast has some life in it if you can see bubbles. And now I'm going to bring this to you in just a moment to show you that this yeast is definitely alive, and it's on its way to helping us make this amazing and deliciously easy pizza dough. There you go. Let me show this to you. Right? You can clearly see that there's some bubbles here. And that bubbles is an indication that this yeast is alive and well. Now let's kind of bring this together with the dry ingredients. So this is about 16 ounces of high gluten flour, basically 2 cups. To this I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of semolina flour and essentially a pinch of salt, about a teaspoon of salt. Now, in my experience, too much salt tends to retard the yeast or kind of pull back its growth. So you don't want to over season the dough at this stage. Mix the dry ingredients ever so slightly. Certainly you can do this in a mixer, in a professional mixer, but there's a great joy in sort of working with dough with your hands. In fact, thinking back to culinary school, this is the one thing that kind of blew my mind. The notion of you can use very, very simple ingredients and create bread, which just blew my mind, that this wet, sort of pale and kind of uninspired looking object that goes in the oven with some temperature and some moisture becomes this amazing, amazing end result, and hence the notion of breaking bread with friends and family. So basically mix the salt, the high gluten flour, a little bit of semolina flour all together. And not unlike making pizza dough, you can make a little bit of a well and drop the warm yeast, honey, water mixture. And now a tablespoon of olive oil. Let's bring this together. Let me use a larger bowl at this stage. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop all these ingredients onto the bench. And essentially this is all about working the dough now, kneading the dough. This is the fun part, if you will. Okay, if you got any jewelry in your hands, this would be the time to sort of take it out so you don't sort of make a mess and have your dough get stuck in it. And now just basically bring this together. Okay, so pulling the dough towards you and sort of mixing in and incorporating the moisture content into the dough. And initially you just want to do it slowly so that you kind of bring the ingredients together. There's no reason to go really fast and kind of be done with it. In fact, I find great joy and relaxation in kind of doing this part of the job. You know, pizza is great and it's really fun to eat, and it's probably my favorite thing to eat in the world if you had to ask me. Just because it's such a template, it's such a vehicle to make all sorts of flavor profiles. I mean, who doesn't like food on a stick, and who doesn't like food on a flatbread, right? So pizza is quintessentially universally loved for that reason. Okay, so bring the dough together and just sort of work it as you would pasta. Okay, so just kind of, you see what I'm doing? I'm sort of bringing it together and using the base of my palm to sort of bring these ingredients together in a way that's going to develop the gluten in the flour. So gluten is naturally a protein structure, and to say that a flour is high gluten is to say that it has the ability, and it has actually natural protein content, and has the ability to create some structure for the bread, in this case the pizza dough. Okay, so just kind of bring this together. In fact, let me use a tool that's very useful at this stage. Bench scraper. That's literally what this object is called, a bench scraper. It's a super fun and super kind of versatile tool, even for vegetables, for example. You've often seen chefs on TV use this tool to pick up a number of vegetables in one swoop so that you're not sort of fighting with, 4 carrots and 3 celery and 2 onions. I'm hoping you saw my previous episode on soup fundamentals, where some of those vegetables form the core flavoring ingredients in the development of a rich, deep flavored soup. Well, enough about soup. We're making pizza dough. If you notice, I'm sort of mindlessly kind of working the dough. I'm not really obsessing over it, but there is a certain motion. There's a certain motion to this kneading process, right? So the base of your hand pulled over, base of your hand pulled over, scrape the dough, bring it together. And if you notice, the amount of ingredients, right? The proportion of ingredients seems to be just right. Now be prepared to have some flexibility here, Dough is finicky, so if your environment is rather moist or dry for that matter, you have to make some adjustments in the proportions. I think about 16 ounces of flour, about 2 tablespoons of semolina flour, about 8 ounces of warm water, a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil, a drop of honey, and a teaspoon of active dry yeast or baker's yeast, and I may have forgotten the salt, but a teaspoon of salt. It will always create this wonderful, pliable dough that is going to have great structure and great mouthfeel, if you will, once it has a chance to rest and relax. So now it's a matter of developing the gluten, right? So the dough has come together. This is sort of the mixing stage. Now you want to spend the next about 3 or 4 minutes to kind of really work this in. And you'll notice it's going to be a little sticky. That's okay. Because if it wasn't, it means it's too dry. You've basically made pizza dough, right? This is it. How easy was that? How easy was that? I mean, do you really need to go buy a frozen dough product? Do you really need to go buy a prepared product in the grocery store that typically has a lot of preservatives, has a lot of stabilizers, if you will? Why? I mean, you've got literally 5 or 6 ingredients that are easily available, extremely inexpensive, and you did this yourself. I should point out that this would be the time, at the dry stage, when you had those flours essentially and the salt, to add flavorings to your dough. So if you wanted a garlic dough or an oregano dough or a rosemary dough, you would chop up those ingredients and incorporate it into the dry stage, right? I chose to make this a basic pizza dough recipe just to give you an idea of how these things come together. And that's it. You could work this another minute or two, but you get the idea. This is pizza dough in the making. Back in the bowl, little cloth to cover it. Keep it in a warm environment. About 2 hours later, this dough is going to double at least in volume. And that's it. With pizza making, you do not punch the dough. So don't deflate all those air bubbles. Just literally start rolling it out and don't do a second fermentation. If the volume is too high, you may have to punch it down just a hair. But essentially, you can just take the dough and start working it. And depending on how much you work the dough, you're going to have a chewy dough or you're going to have a very tender dough. But that's it. There you have it. Pizza dough making 101. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope that was instructive. And I hope that inspires you to go make some delicious pizza. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day. See you next class.